So the first question you might ask is, why is a guy from Texas talking to you about blind inlets and too much water? We don't get a whole lot of issues with too much water in Texas, unless we get a hurricane. But I was actually working in West Lafayette, Indiana for about a dozen years up until 2014. The winter of 2013-2014 got too cold for me, and keeping the kids inside for a full week, no school, for kind of drove me crazy, so I went back home. So I do appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today, and I do appreciate y'all organizing the snow shower so I can remember why I need to go back home. But I want to talk to you about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's a project we had over in Indiana, and we also have a little bit of data added from Minnesota on blind inlets. Working on this presentation really brought back a lot of great memories, and so you may or may not have seen some of these pictures that I've got in this presentation. But we know that there's a lot of sediment loading to Lake Erie. Eileen this morning mentioned working with some people from Iowa, and they said, well, we never see sediment in our tile. And this was about 2002, 2003, and we thought, we never see sediment in our tile either. And then we got to walking around during a storm, and sure enough, occasionally we do see sediment coming out of the tile. That could be from a tile blowout, but there are potentially other reasons why we're seeing that. Actually, we had a meeting on Lake Erie on this day. It was 3 days after a 3 or 4 inch storm. I remember being at Maumee Bay State Park and looking at the chocolate milk right here in the Maumee Bay. That's about 3 days of travel time for that water to get there. Y'all may have seen a time or two. It's not only the sediment that's an issue, it's the phosphorus getting to the water. Don't want to belabor that point too much. But in this watershed study that we had over in Ohio, or over in Indiana, sorry, we noticed that the more direct drainage we saw to the streams or to the ditches, the more the nutrients we had. And also, the more of these little dudes that we had, the more concentration of nutrients, or the more load of nutrients that we saw. This particular pothole is almost 2 miles away from the stream. Do you think that this farmer ever thought what I do in this field is going to wind up directly in that stream? Probably not. We've done a really great job of short-circuiting the hydrology in this landscape. As mentioned before, a lot of this land was the black swamp. Without draining this land, there's no way it would be as productive as it is today. But there are some trade-offs with that. So this is the watershed that we worked in. There's a few people that work in this watershed and live in this watershed here at the meeting. You can see here's a stream, and these blue areas near the stream is where we know that there's direct drainage to that stream. The kind of two tan or beige, grayish areas, that's areas where we can't identify a direct flow path of surface water to that stream. We're pretty sure that water is getting there through the tile drainage network. The red areas, those red areas are potholes, and then each of the black dots are where we estimate that a tile riser would be if that field is farmed. So one of the things we wanted to do early on, about 15 years ago, We knew that there were issues with sediment moving to the water. The phosphorus issues hadn't really reared their ugly heads yet. But we thought we really wanted to find a way to kind of break that cycle. You can see with this particular inlet design, those holes are about as big around as your thumb. So anything smaller than a corn stalk is probably going to move through that. We knew that we wanted to do something. We didn't know exactly what. We didn't want to lose productive land. Sometimes, especially in dry years, these are the most productive portions of the fields. In talking with farmers, we knew that they don't really like driving around these things. How many of you have equipment 12 rows or larger? How many rows? 34? 24? Okay. It's not a whole lot of fun to guide around these, is it? It'd really be beneficial if this could be approved for cost share. And we need to maintain effectively draining the landscape. If we can't perform the function just like this tile riser, then it's not going to do us any good. First, I'm going to talk about a study that a gentleman named Gary Feiereisen did in Minnesota. Here he had two fields, a pair of 160-acre fields, where he installed French drains. Quite a few of them over these two fields. Let's see, tile outlets measured, so the tile drains, or the tile system drains here on this east field. It's kind of in the middle of that field. They have a little different design than what we used in Indiana. Theirs is more of a rock inlet design. So they have roughly 20 or 30 feet linearly. They have a 6-inch or a couple inches of soil over about maybe 3 or 4 foot of pea gravel rock. So looking down the tile line there, this is what it looks like. And so they've got a period of up to 2009 is when they monitored it prior to installation of these French drains. And as you've heard, the amount of water moving through the system changes a lot of the variables. So in this particular instance, these dark blue lines are the discharge and the light blue lines are the sediment. And just looking at these 2 years, 2009 and 2011, where the discharge is roughly similar, we see a pretty good reduction in the sediment. They looked at things in the snowmelt period as well as the non-snowmelt period. And one of the things that they saw is that during the snowmelt period, this system doesn't necessarily work that well for sediment. And they did see some infiltration of sediment into their design. During the non-snowmelt period, so up to 2009, remember, is when the pre-French drain period, and then post-French drain. So here you see the dark red line is the average suspended sediment concentration, and then the orange one is the maximum suspended sediment. And you see after 2009, pretty good reductions in the amount of, especially the maximum flow of sediments. For soluble phosphorus, they did show a little bit of a reduction in the soluble phosphorus moving through these systems, but it's a little bit confounded because a lot of times as you start to work in some of these fields and you're really focused on something, it sparks the producer's his wheels really start to turn, and he thinks, well, I need to do this and I need to do that. And those of us that have worked on research on farms appreciate the farmers, what all they do, but in this case, that farmer reduced the amount of manure he was applying to the fields. So we can't really say if that's a byproduct of reduced applications or installation of the rock inlets. So switching gears to what we did over in Indiana, and I need to acknowledge Stan Livingston, who's in the audience today, who was really the brains and the back power behind a lot of what went on here. We did get this approved for a conservation practice under Practice Code 620, which is an underground outlet. Here you can see the cover sheet for that design. So the study area that we had in 2004 is when we installed these sites. See there are two different names, ADW and ADE. A means it's our A watershed, D means it's the depression site, and then east and west. These are about 10-acre watersheds each. And if we look from the top down, this is kind of what we did. So we have both our blind inlet that we installed as well as a tile riser so that we could toggle back and forth between the two. To have kind of a little bit of scientific control over what we were looking at. So this is the first set of blind inlets that we started constructing. This is a 10-foot by 10-foot design. You can see there's some limestone gravel there at the bottom. We put in septic tile line, put in some more gravel. These are sizable, so if you have a larger depression, then you can increase the size of these, increase that drainage density. Put gravel up to about a foot from the surface, and then we put landscape fabric over it. Here you can see this is, again, our study site, and we wanted to be able to compare this tile riser to the blind inlet. So what we would do is on one field we would be draining with the blind inlet, on the other field with the tile riser. And we could switch back and forth as we needed to. So we've put landscape fabric over that gravel and then filled it with a coarse soil mix. And then that allows the farmer to move right over it. Since we did those initial designs and working with NRCS, they wanted all of that gravel to be encased in landscape fabric. So on the right there you can see kind of what that looks like. And then on the left is a standard tile riser during an event. Can't really show you a good picture of a blind inlet during an event because it's just ponded water. So question is often, does this work as effectively as the tile riser? And I can tell you in the 14 years now that we've been studying this site, let's see, the design is to drain a 2-year, 24-hour storm period within 24 hours. And we've accomplished that every time. This isn't the only blind inlets that were put out in the field. Let's see, in these fields there hasn't been any crop loss because of the blind inlet. They don't always drain at the same rate or for the same amount of time. Part of that is an artifact of how we had to plumb the system. So in this particular instance, it's the same storm. It's let's see, 33. So it's an 1.5 inch storm. You can see that the tile riser shot up really quick, flowed for about the same rate for, let's see, I think that's, so from 6 p.m. until noonish, so 18 hours, and then it was drained. You can see here that our blind inlet, it shot up and it flowed at a fairly constant rate until this tile riser quit running, and then we bumped up a little bit. And that's a little bit of an artifact of how we had to plumb this system. There's not much back pressure on that tile riser, so it's allowed to flow right through to the drainage outlet. With the blind inlet, you know, the water has to go through a bit of a tortuous path to get to the outlet. So there's kind of a reduced head on it once it reaches the tile line. So the tile riser is allowed to put a little bit of back pressure, extra back pressure on that blind inlet, in just an artifact of the way we had this plumbed. I want to show you an absolute worst case scenario that we tested with our blind inlet. So in 2008, the fields are larger than the 10 acres that are in that drained area. I think they're maybe 25 or 30 acres apiece. So on the east side, which we decided to drain in 2009, we decided to drain it with the riser. In 2008, the corn looked good. It was a dry year. The farmer harvested that for corn grain. I think we talked him into no-tilling that year, so we had a virtually 100% residue cover in 2009. So it's an absolute best case scenario to test the tile riser. The blind inlet, let's move back to 2008. On the west side, the corn looked really drouthy. He was afraid that he wasn't going to get much grain out of that. He does raise livestock, so he decided to cut that side for silage. So you can see here on this picture, we only had about 10% residue cover on that field. In addition to that, we hadn't located the tile that drains the rest of that field, so we had done a whole lot of digging to install this site so that we could monitor the tile that drains the rest of that field. So it's been a few years since that particular tile had been put in. We asked the gentleman that owns the land where he thought his tile was. He said, well, it's right here. So we went and we dug right there, and it wasn't there. He said, well, it might be over here. I think it's right there, but it might be over here. So we dug right there, 3 or 4 or 5 different places, and we finally went back to the same location that we started at and dug about another foot, and that's where it was. So we had a lot of extra disturbance on that field. In addition to digging around, he did plow that side. So, you know, a lot of disturbance on that field, not much cover to start with, and that low residue cover will come into play in just a second also on something else. So blind inlet, absolute worst case scenario. Tile riser, absolute best case scenario. And so let's see what happens. So 2009, when we tested it like this, we only saw an 11% reduction in the amount of sediment using the blind inlet. Is that a bad thing? Yes, no, maybe. Never going to use it because it doesn't do anything for sediment? Well, remember we had about 100% residue cover on that field that we were testing the blind inlet or the tile riser with, so there wasn't a whole lot of sediment moving. So we did clean up a whole lot of the sediment coming out of the west field. But when we compare it to the other field, there just wasn't a whole lot of sediment. So that number looks funny, but it's actually pretty good. We reduced everything else in 2009 except for nitrates. Can anybody think of why we might have more nitrate moving through the system? So my initial thought was, well, we're draining from a deeper part of the soil, so that's got to be it. But if we remember back to the amount of residue cover, so the crop didn't go as far into maturity, it didn't remove as much nitrogen from the soil to begin with, so there's a little bit of extra nitrogen laying around in the field, right? The other field had a lot of residue there. What do microbes like? They like that residue, but what else do they have to have? They got to have nitrogen. So in the field where we didn't have any residue, do you think that the microbes were able to use that nitrogen? So we had a lot of excess nitrogen just laying around in that field. So I'm not going to say that blind inlets are going to cure the nitrate problems of the world, but this number is the result of an absolute worst case scenario, not because we're doing something wrong. 2010 numbers here look a lot more typical of what we see. So 70-80% reductions in sediment, 70-75% reductions in soluble and total phosphorus, and 20 to 40 or 50% reductions in nitrate. So have a whole lot of, I think we had maybe 80 storms where we had runoff data, and this is just the summation of all of that information. So when we drained it with the riser and compare it to the blind inlet, we generally see about an order of magnitude decrease in the soluble phosphorus and about a 70 or 80% reduction in the amount of total phosphorus. I have a colleague that still works at the lab. He sent me this information. So this is for atrazine. The reason why we started this project was actually the whole Watershed project was because of atrazine getting into drinking water for Fort Wayne. You can see by using the blind inlet in this storm, we did decrease the amount of atrazine leaving the field. Looking at the overall pesticide losses, so we have, this is for each year. 2012 was a dry year where everything worked perfectly. Atrazine, glyphosate, 2,4-D, metolachlor, and you can see when we average all those years together, the blind inlet does a pretty good job at pulling out the atrazine and the 2,4-D and the metolachlor. Glyphosate, it's only about 10% reduction there, but overall it's not only working for the sediment and the phosphorus, but also for the pesticides, we think. In that project over in Indiana, we had 4 different practices that we were able to test on fields. So we had grassed waterways, blind inlet, conservation crop rotation, which is basically a longer crop rotation than corn, soybean. In this particular instance, it was corn, soybean, wheat, oat, alfalfa. And then tillage, which the conservation practice there would be no tillage. And we've got the relative change in annual load. So what we want to see in this graph is a negative number, is a good number. So for example, here you can see with the grassed waterway is designed for what constituent of concern? nitrogen. Actually sediment. Put in the grass waterways to try to pull out the gully erosion. You see it does a really good job for sediment. When I was going to school not too many years ago, you stop the sediment, you stop the phosphorus. It's true for total phosphorus, but not necessarily for soluble phosphorus. Let's see, conservation crop rotation worked real well for the soluble or the phosphorus constituents as well as sediment, but not the nitrogen. Tillage does a good, no tillage, sorry, does a good job with the sediment and the total phosphorus. Some confounding issues with nitrate and soluble phosphorus. The only one that performed as we hoped it would on all the constituents that we measured was the blind inlet. We also had the opportunity to look at this on a larger watershed scale. In order for Indiana NRCS to adopt this practice, they wanted to see it more than in just one field. So we had about a 600-acre watershed. There were 13 tile risers in that watershed. We talked with all the producers and landowners and were able to remove all the tile risers and put in blind inlets. Here again, we got to tinkering around in parts of this watershed, and the landowners got to thinking, well, you know, I really need to clean up that part of the ditch, and if I do this here, then I can start farming a little different here, and so we only got about 2 years worth of usable data. I'm not fussing at anybody about anything. It's just when we start tinkering around, their gears really start to moving, and a lot of things change that are out of our control. So we've only really got 2 years worth of data. The first year is 2009, which was before the blind inlet. It was a dry year, unfortunately. 2010 was a wetter year. And this is stream gauge data. And if everybody would stand up, spin around like 5 times, cross your eyes, this really makes good sense. But so this is stream data. So at the ag ditch, and what we see is that the phosphorus concentrations increase at low discharges. So again, it's a dry year. So what I'm confident happened there was we did have some small events that caused the tile risers to flow. This was before we replaced them with blind inlets. So there was some sediment getting into those tile risers, moving into the stream that we were able to capture. 2010, which is after we'd installed all the blind inlets, you can see these smaller events here. There wasn't as much phosphorus moving through the system. The only time that we got higher levels of phosphorus was whenever the stream started moving. So we switched from upland phosphorus showing us spikes in the phosphorus concentration to now it's the stream processes. So the stream's starting to move, it's starting to pick up sediment and some different things. So you can uncross your eyes now. So also asked to speak about the agronomic performance of these systems. So this is the field where we first did our studies, where we put in the tile riser, which you can see, and then the blind inlet, which you can also see, believe it or not. So this kind of bare area here is where he planted some oats. So this is on farm 1. So this gentleman here saw what we did on farm 1, really liked it, and improved on it, and on his own, without any cost share money or anything, they put in probably 10 or 15 of these within a couple of years. And this is one of those, and you can see it's soybeans. They really liked it because they can move right through the field without having to guide around that riser. This gentleman, he's in the process of kind of getting out of the farming, and he's really driven to leave his farm to his kids and his grandkids in better shape than he got it. This is the third farm in wheat, and you can see actually 2 blind inlets there, so one here and another one right there. It's all about water relations. You're not going to produce as much grain there, but in this instance, he's definitely got a little bit of wheat there that he's going to be able to harvest. So, in conclusion, we know that some of these distant fields are directly connected to streams. We can break that connection hydrologically as well as for the nutrients and other issues of concern by installing blind inlets. And agronomically, some of the producers we worked with really like this because they're able to work their fields directly through that whole area.